Welcome, everybody. And it's a great honor for us to present this book. And we more than look forward to your reactions and your comments. It's a theme that usually interests lots of people about identity. Who am I? What kind of person am I? And of course, on this theme of what it means to be or to become Chinese, ideally, we would do it in the Chinese language. But we're in a university with a heritage, and so therefore we do it in English. But in the question and answer period, I think it's okay to have Cantonese and Mandarin, if the rules allow. Yeah, okay. And so thank you very much. And I should say, by the way, the capitalism as a way of life is in the basic law, correct? Yeah, but we're not allowed to sell books. So even though it's a capitalist society, we're not allowed to sell books, but there's a 20% discount here if there's a code here. So with your QR code, I think I can say this, I don't make a profit on it myself. So you can put on you can click the code and get a discount. And we also have a couple of extra books here. We don't know what it would be a fair principle to distribute them, maybe quality of questions and comments. Right, most active. Each of us will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will have a comment by Professor Wong as well for 10 minutes, a little bit of discussion among ourselves, and then we leave most of the time for questions and comments and participation. And this is also streamed live, so yeah, so whatever is said here does not stay in the room. I don't know if you want to keep that in mind. So let me just say a little bit about what motivated this book. And it started, as you might expect, since I'm the editor, as a kind of personal project. I was born in Canada, but I've spent most of my life in China. And more, especially in mainland China, people started saying to me, oh, you're like, sometimes they would even say like, you're more Chinese than we are. I was saying, what does that mean exactly? And then I was saying, well, what exactly does it mean? Obviously, when they say that, it means that it doesn't refer to my ethnicity or race or family background. It refers to something like speaking the language, participating in certain ways of life, being maybe polite and humble. And also, of course, my family and friends are mainly Chinese. And sometimes it's also a matter of your heart changes, frankly. Like I remember in the 2008 Olympics, this might be on record, when there's a competition, for example, between the US and China, frankly, I would cheer for China, so my heart has changed in many ways. And even my body, like now I'm kind of allergic to milk, which I never used to be. I prefer hot water to cold water. The idea of drinking cold ice water, it's like, why did people do that? And even so, it's kind of peculiar. And even the idea of also going to beach and getting suntanned. Why would people do that? It sounds so odd to me now. But of course, it would have been natural to people, who were born in Canada and stayed there for their whole lives. So then I wrote this piece for the Wall Street Journal, and the title was, I didn't choose the title. The headline was Anyone Can Be Chinese. And it was a simple idea that the idea of Chineseness as tied to race, ethnicity is a fairly recent idea, starting from the late Qing dynasty. Professor Chen will have more to say about that. But before that, it was more a matter of culture and way of life. And so long as you partake of the culture and way of life, you can become Chinese. But of course, it was a very simple view, and I got severely, severely criticized because there was one throwaway line about, just like in the US, you don't have to be white to be American, anybody can be American. So in China, you don't have to be, a certain skin color to be Chinese. And all these Asian Americans wrote back saying, who's this white guy telling us we face discrimination all the time on the basis of our skin color? It's not so simple as you say. Okay, I agree with that. So what I decided to do then is just, let's invite these great experts in law, in philosophy, in history, to tell us what exactly it means to be or to become Chinese to them. And that's what led to this book. And so I'm pretty happy with the result. So we have 4 sections in this book. The first section is worldview, basically. What does it mean in terms of how you look at the world from a Chinese perspective? And there's very key differences here. So we have great articles by Zhao Tingyang and Roger Ames, and they say that if you look at the world through a world of constant change and flux, unlike the typical Western view where there's a kind of fixed eternal being out there, which is the ultimate reality. And then we have historical perspectives. What it means to be or to become Chinese has changed tremendously over time. There's no stable answer to that. So we have wonderful historians who, including Wang Hui at Tsinghua, and Peter Bowl and Patricia Ebry, and Yuri Pines, who have provided wonderful articles from that perspective. And it's also normative perspective. Like when I'm in China and people say, wow, you're Chinese, that is a term of praise. It means it's a good thing. But again, what exactly does it mean to be Chinese from a kind of positive point of view? So here we have values like filial piety that Professor Wang will talk about today. And we have other chapters too that are helpful here, but we won't discuss them in depth. And finally, the most obvious point of view now is being Chinese means you're a Chinese citizen, right? It means and Professor Chen, who's the leading expert on this question, wrote a wonderful article in this book, which he will discuss. So these are some of the issues. I just want to end with one little thing. There was a recent article in Zhonghua Dushu Bao, which is like a bit like the New York Review of Books because it has essays and book reviews, but it's also semi-official because it's read by public officials in China. And there was an article, it's just in September 24 this year, like about a month ago, and it was about the revival of Confucianism and how it influences social science in China. And I was very honored to be mentioned in that article. I'll just read you a line very quickly, and then I'll translate it. It was 事实上已经不能算老外, they use scare quotes, 老外的加拿大学者被担任教授. So that means, oh, what does that mean? Well, when they say that I'm Canadian, I guess it refers to my identity and the place where I'm brought up, or to my citizenship, I should say. But when they say that I'm not really a Laowai, I don't really count as a Laowai, as a foreigner. To me, it's a great compliment. I was very moved to see that. But again, what exactly does that mean? That's what we're going to talk about today. So this topic, it's of great interest. Of course, the foreigners who are fascinated by China and who want to become Chinese, but also of people who are more comfortable with the Chinese identity. Think about what it really means. I mean, these are really fascinating questions. But we're going to begin with Professor Chen, who everybody knows here, the leading expert on constitutional law in Hong Kong and mainland China, and a wonderful scholar. And his article on citizenship is really the best I've seen on this topic. So please, 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. I think we have chosen this date for this book talk as tomorrow is National Day holiday. So, so for various reasons, this is a good day for our talk. We have given a book talk on this book in the book fair. So at that talk, I only talk about my chapter, but I think to do justice to the book, and since many of you are not from our law faculty, so I think I'll briefly mention 3 chapters of this book in my 10-minute talk, including my own. But as Professor Bell has just said, this book is actually an interdisciplinary. The subtitle of this book is Interdisciplinary Reflections on Chinese Identity. So we have authors who are very distinguished scholars of Chinese philosophy, Chinese history, Chinese culture, and so on. So I will first say a few words about my own chapter, which is chapter 10, the evolution of modern Chinese nationality law. And then I will say a few words about chapter 1 by Zhao Tingyang, called To Be or To Become a Chinese. That is the question. And then finally, I will say a few words about the chapter on Taiwan, Chapter 8, The Dilemmas of Becoming Chinese in Taiwan, written by Max Huang Kou. What is his Chinese name?
Wang Ke.
Wang Kewu, who is a very famous scholar in Taiwan. So my chapter explores the history of Chinese nationality law. In traditional China, there's no concept of the Chinese state and Chinese nationals or citizens of the Chinese state. China was the center of center of a kind of global universe, what is called Tiansha. Actually, in this book, there are two other chapters about Tiansha, and I'll not talk too much about it, but Tiansha is based on the concept of universal kingship. So the Chinese emperor is at the center of this Tiansha, and China is surrounded by tributary states, which all recognize the position of the Chinese emperor as the son of heaven. And then in the 19th century, China entered the international community of states. As you know, beginning with the Opium War, China was forced to become integrated in the international community of states established by the Western powers. China came into contact with public international law as it developed in the West, particularly in 1864 with the translation into Chinese of Professor Wheaton's book called Elements of International Law. So Chinese scholars and intellectuals became acquainted with the idea of states in international law, and each state has its own citizens or nationals. So to modernize China's legal system, the Qing dynasty enacted the first nationality law for China, for Chinese people, in 1909. This nationality law adopted the so-called jus sanguinis principle as the basis for determining Chinese nationality. At that time, and even today, there are two basic principles used in different states for determining nationality. One is the jus sanguinis principle, based on the status of the parent of the child. And the other is just solely principle based on the place, the territory or the state in which the child was born. So just China adopted the patrilineal version of the jus sanguinis principle, which is to say, in order to determine whether somebody is a Chinese national or citizen, we look at whether his father, whether his or her father is Chinese. So I quote to you the relevant sentence in the Chinese nationality law of 1909, which is that if a person has Chinese nationality, if his or her father is a 中国人, okay, so you actually find the word 中国人 in this law. Then this person has 中国国籍, irrespective of where he or she was born. The nationality law actually was drafted on the basis of Western European models, as well as the Japanese nationality law, which was also used as a model. The Japanese nationality law was enacted in 1899. So now, when the Republic of China was established, the first nationality law of the ROC, Republic of China, was enacted in 1912, and then amended in 1929 when the KMT set up the Nanjing government. So this 1929 nationality law of the ROC is still largely enforced in Taiwan today, subject to some amendments introduced in recent decades. So you have citizens of the under the ROC nationality law, but then we also have citizens of the PRC. PRC was established in 1949, and the first nationality law and the only nationality law of the PRC was enacted in the year 1980. But even before then, the basic principles of PRC nationality law had already been developed, which actually followed the Qing law in adopting the just sanguinis principle, but then modified it so that the nationality of the male or female parent, that is father or mother, would be equally taken into account in determining the nationality of the child. And then this nationality also introduced a new principle, which was to avoid dual nationality. Because before the PRC was established, these situations of dual nationality was very common among overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia and also other parts of the world because of the just sanguinis principle of Chinese nationality. So somebody born in a Southeast Asian territory of Chinese parents would still be considered Chinese under the Chinese nationality law. So the PRC made a special effort to eliminate or to minimize the problem of dual nationality. It actually negotiated with Southeast Asian states and encouraged the overseas Chinese there to become naturalized as nationals or citizens of those local states so that they will no longer be Chinese citizens. Actually, the PRC nationality law also now provides that if somebody is born outside China of Chinese parents, this person will not have Chinese nationality if one or both of the parents who were originally Chinese nationals have settled in the foreign state, and this baby acquires the nationality of the foreign state by birth. So that provision would avoid the situation of foreign nationality. So that is the basic principle of the PRC nationality law today. And since I'm running out of time, I'll now turn to say a few words about the two other chapters. Chapter 1 by Zhao Tingyang is about what is Chineseness. Okay, so his view is that we have to look at different aspects of Chineseness, particularly Chinese history. He talked about the traditional Chinese worldview of Tiansha and Da Yi Tong, the grand unity of China. He actually talked about one country, many systems in some periods of Chinese history. So he said that one country, two systems, which is now being applied in Hong Kong, is actually not entirely new, because in Chinese history, there have been one country, many systems for people belonging to diverse ethnic groups. He particularly emphasized one particular aspect of Chinese culture, which is what he calls relational rationality, which he defines. He says that relational rationality means the minimization of mutual hostilities among the persons who are in a relationship with one another, or rather than the maximization of exclusive interest or self-interest. And the traditional Chinese emphasis on relational rationality means that existence presupposes coexistence. And he says that this kind of relational rationality can best describe the Chinese way of thinking. So lastly, I want to say a few words about the chapter about Taiwan. Now, this is a very important question, particularly since the PRC has also proposed one country, two systems for Taiwan. So in this chapter 8 on Taiwan, the author points out that there has been an emergence of identity differences between people in the mainland and the people in Taiwan, particularly in view of Taiwan's political change since the late 1980s and its democratization. So there's now different kinds of identity among people in Taiwan. And the author particularly mentions the dilemmas of Taiwan's Chinese culturalists. So these people in Taiwan identify themselves as Chinese, as culturally Chinese, their cultural identity as a Chinese, but they are not able to identify themselves with mainland China's political system. Instead, they believe in some kind of liberal democratic political institution, as is what is practiced in Taiwan today. So, and there's an interesting sentence here. Chinese culturalists in Taiwan believe that as long as Taiwanese hold on to their belief in cultural China, the place where they live is China. But he also mentions that these Chinese culturalists in Taiwan are actually probably a minority in Taiwan today, and they are under increasing pressure. So that's all I want to say by way of introducing the 3 chapters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We should also mention there's a chapter by Xiang Shuchen, which touches a bit on Taiwan. But if you want to read on Taiwan, I suggest buying the English version of this book, because the Chinese version of this book might be somewhat different. Now, let's turn to Professor Wang Pei, who will talk about the value of sometimes xiao, which is sometimes read as filiality or filial piety, which is often regarded as a very central, if not the central, Chinese value. And but it's also problematic. So let's.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bell, for organizing this event. And my chapter in this book basically talks about what's the most important virtue in Chinese ethics. Thinking about that, sometimes we'll think that we have so many virtues that we can choose from. Like we have a huge list of virtues, like 仁义礼智信, yes, a lot. But can you really be a person attaining those virtues? Are you a 人 person, 义 person, 礼 person, whatever? Think about that. Like take 2 seconds to do a little bit of self-reflection. But if you judge yourself as I'm unfilial, that's a serious thing. That's why I'm talking about filial piety in this chapter, because I was think that it's something that everyone do care about and really think like we can make it. Okay, so for filial piety, like historically speaking, it was very important for Chinese culture. Thinking about from Han Dynasty, we promote, select and promote government officials if they're filial. Yes, 举孝廉. If you're really filial, you can be a government official. And nowadays in Shandong province, I know somewhere from Shandong province, if you wanted to get promoted, your parents would have some visitors, mysterious visitors, asking them that, how about your kid? Is he or she filial or not? If the answer is no, you shall be very, very careful, because you probably cannot get promoted. It's called, there is a special regulation on that called 官员不尽孝不得提拔. If you have an ambition in the government in the future, better to serve your parents in a better way. Another thing that for being a Chinese, like as Professor Chen mentioned, like we consider ourselves a relational self. So what social relations are important? We think there are 5 are very important. Yes, you know, 五伦, 5 human relations. The first is among parents and children. That's something we're talking about that today, filial piety. And the second is about the ruler and the ministers. I think 99.9% of us won't be ministers in the future. Probably some of you will be, but I guess 99% of the population, there's no need to consider about that relation. And next, the spousal relations, husband and a wife. Now there's a trend online. I think we should take it very seriously. Then young generations have this trend saying that 不婚不育保平安. Yeah, like no marriage, no child, you can be safe till that. it's a very serious trend, and that's why I take it serious. If you wanted to escape the spousal relation, it's highly possible. Okay, after that, it's the relation between siblings, among siblings. So I don't know how many of you are single kid in the family due to the one-child policy in mainland. So for young generation in mainland, they do not, many of them do not experience sibling relations. So we can escape that relation as well. And in the very end, friendship. Okay. And I think there's another new trend online. Everyone is saying that I'm very introvert. Yeah, 社恐. So you can escape friendship as well. So among these 5 human relations, you can properly escape 4 out of 5. But the only one you really cannot escape is that relation with your parents. Yeah, that's why it makes filial piety, the virtue of filial piety becomes something that's unavoidable for everyone to answer. And for nowadays, in this chapter I mentioned, there is the crisis of filial piety in modern China. One thing that I didn't mention in this chapter, I want to bring it out today because I see so many female participants here, is that filial piety is actually a very gendered virtue, thinking about that. In ancient times, in Mengzi, if you read Mengzi, Mengzi said, this is a taught from Zhou Wenwang, that if you really want to take care of your parents, what do you do? What would you do? His suggestion is that get married, get a wife. So your wife will take care of your parents. Then you can go out to work to feed the whole family. Isn't that quite something familiar for our families experiencing today? That a husband is working outside and the wife is taking care of both sides of parents. Nowadays it's even worse, because in ancient times girls didn't need to take care of her own parents. Okay, think about it. It's a daughter-in-law's duty to take care of the parents. Okay, another thing is that about the intergenerational conflicts among parents and kids, because there is no common language, no common understanding about filial piety. Parents always think that you're not obedient enough, like equal obedience to filial piety, and kids think, oh, I'm flourishing, like honoring the family, honoring my parents and also my ancestors, I'm also filial. Yes, so we need to develop a new language so that both sides could understand. And I can see so many young people feeling so struggled that I do feel guilty. So guilty is another thing in this story. Like 2 months ago, there was a law professor from Toronto invited by law faculty giving talk here in the same room, talking about special group in mainland China called, I'm not sure whether you know about this language, are 剩女, leftover women in China. They're about certain age and they just do not have a good chance to get married and get children for the parents. And they're in a special, very struggling situation. And their parents sometimes want them to skip the law to get a child for them. Thinking about that's a talk I attended 2 months ago. Today, I want to mention this as well. For many young generations, young people, they feel so painful in this relation. Like, why do I feel such challenge, struggling in the relation with my own parents? Yes, but thinking from another perspective, because you love them so much. That's why I feel so painful. Yeah, but from a Confucian perspective, I wanted to provide something like against this pain. Like in Confucianism, we talk about joy very much. 乐, like the 天伦之乐, the happiness, the joy among familial relations. So definitely filial piety is not a virtue based on guilt, but based on joy. But it's a 10-minute speech. I cannot offering or promising a solution for you today, but I just hope this short introduction can encourage everyone to think about it.
You have time, 2 minutes to say a solution.
Well, probably start by reading the article that I contribute to this book, and yeah, keep thinking and keep feeling in the direction. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So as a completely unbiased observer, I think Professor Wong has written the best works on filial piety. There's 5 or 6 articles, including this one. And now we move on to the discussant, who's Professor Brian Wong. And normally at his young age, we would say a rising star, but I think we just say a star. Just call him a star. And he's going to comment on this book for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Professors Bell, Professor Chen, also Professor Wang. Thank you very much for having me here. I just want to start by saying, if you haven't gotten a copy of this, and I'm not selling books here, yeah, but I thoroughly recommend this. It's a real excellent read. Get hold of it whilst you can. You can take a photo of me with a book as well. It's a great idea. So I'm going to be exploring, broadly speaking, 3 questions under the following theme. What does it mean to be Chinese? That's the anchoring question. And the 3 sub-questions I ask is, firstly, what are the stakes involved in addressing this question? Secondly, is this a good question to ask in the first place? And finally, what's my answer to this very question? So I'm going to go through them one by one as a sort of roadmap and a structure for my response. Firstly, what exactly are the stakes involved? Well, I think there is certainly a high degree of intense politicization surrounding questions of Chineseness, whether it be in relation to cross-straits relations that Albert already looked at and examined just then, or if you look at the CPC's constant emphasis upon Chineseness, whether it be in a narration of 中华伟大中华文明复兴, alternatively 中国梦, or even narratives about global governance and global civilizational initiatives. There's a lot of invoking of Chinese, ex-Chinese civilization, Chinese culture, Chinese identity, Chinese community, as a means of bolstering, really, the party state's legitimacy both at home and also abroad. And finally, if you haven't already, tuned into one of these hearings on the Senate in Capitol Hill, you really shouldn't, because it's soul destroying. But I had the pleasure of watching one, or the unfortunate experience of watching one, where the TikTok CEO was grilled by a bunch of American parliamentarians over his identity. And essentially, the conversation proceeded as follows. One of the senators said, "Excuse me, are you a member of the Chinese Communist Party?" And the guy said, "No, sir, I'm Singaporean. I served in the Singaporean army." "So does that mean you're Chinese?" "No, sir, I'm a Singaporean citizen. I do not serve any other country other than myself, and I work for a private company, sir." And this conversation goes to show that it's not just the Chinese government that's politicizing Chineseness. This is also a deeply politicized and weaponized label in contemporary America, where being Chinese is only second to being liberal in Trump America in terms of the list of stigmatized and persecuted minorities. I hope that isn't too sensitive to say here in Hong Kong. The second observation I'll note is this is also not a trivial question insofar as it touches upon very emotional, sentiments, right? When folks say to Daniel, "Wow, you really, 你差不多就是咱们自己人了啊，你差不多就是这个中国人了." That gives him a sense of pride. It's a form of affirmation. On the flip side, when some other folks say, "Oh, all these Chinese should go back to where they come from," that is embedded with vengeance, with vindictiveness, with anger and ostracization. It's a very emotively charged conversation and discussion at large. And indeed, finally, I would propose that the term Chinese serves at least 3 very distinctive purposes. The first is the interpretive. It allows us to interpret whom we are, whom others are, and how we relate with one another. The second is the prescriptive, or as I put it more cynically, behavioral and also attitudinal policing. And this is where I want to bring in Xiao. Don't get me wrong, I believe in the abstract principle and importance of Xiao, but very often the argument operates along the lines as follows. "You're Chinese, you have to listen to me because I'm your mom or I'm your dad," okay? Or "You're Chinese, so for you to not have filial piety exhibited is particularly bad." But I didn't consent to being born into a Chinese family. I didn't consent to enrolling into a Chinese civilization per se. I was raised in it. So then a very intuitive response is to say, surely, we shouldn't be policed and judged by norms that we didn't necessarily voluntarily accede to. Now, there's a whole lot of normative debate that takes place in political philosophy about whether or not this sort of line of argument and defense is valid or invalid, but I do think it's rather interesting. And the final function concerning Chinese is the expressive function. So when I say, I am Chinese, and I say that to a room full of Chinese, like Jensen Huang does, right? He says, 我也是华人, right? And he said that, of course, not to sell more chips, right? But to instead demonstrate that he really cares about the Chineseness that he exhibits, whatever it is. I don't want to speculate over Jensen Huang's intentions, but one way or the other, it's apparent that it's a very expressive and loaded exercise he's undertaking and committing to there, so to speak. So in short, these are the reasons why we should find this question. What does it mean to be Chinese? An interesting question to ask. Okay, let's move on to the second sub-question then. Is this a good question to ask? Because very frankly, we can argue quite straightforwardly that there is no single acceptable definition of Chineseness that we can reduce all understandings of Chineseness to. You could argue that it is a cultural concept, right? 文化,中国,中华文化. That's one way of interpreting Chinese. Or you can argue that it's an ethnic and genetic argument as examined by Patricia Ebery in this very, very good book. The idea that it is indeed a genetic Chinese ID, Han Chinese. But then what does that make folks like us who are born as descendants of, the Yue people, Nan Yue, right? And I often make this argument in my debate, a debate with folks who argue that there's one single Chinese ethnicity. I say, what about all these other ethnic minorities, including, of course, Nan Yue, Qingzu, Beizu, Zhuangzu. They're also Chinese, right? If you listen to 爱我中华, 里面就是说我们是55个这个兄弟姐妹同聚一堂，同聚一家，对不对？爱我中华，爱我中华，爱我中华3次. So if that's indeed the case then, right, does the ethnic-centered or the ethnically oriented argument not thereby exclude all these other non-Han Chinese, but still constituent nationalities within the Chinese nation, quote unquote, or meta-nation? Or perhaps we can adopt the sort of civilizational interpretation that Roger Ames and Zhao Dingyang talked about, rooted in relationality. But then again, when reading those chapters, I ask myself, okay, what if I'm someone who believes in care ethics? I subscribe to Carol Gilligan. I think I should think about relations, okay, as a means of understanding ethics. But I see myself as distinctly Canadian. Then does that make me Chinese? Am I therefore Canadian Chinese in virtue of my relational worldview? Perhaps not. So there are issues with each and every one of these interpretations we have to think about here. And perhaps a standard cop-out answer that I could give you here right away is to say, there's no single definition. You do you. You can pick and choose like a menu. Okay. But then you're going to walk away from that thinking, wow, I just got cheated, because that's a scam, right? I promised you an answer and I gave you this cop-out. We're not going to feel satisfied with that sort of pluralist answer for 3 reasons. And the first is we want to be able to call out abusive or detrimental conceptions like super ethno-supremacist, ethno-nationalistic conceptions of Chineseness, alternatively, unduly politicized notions of Chineseness that disregards, of course, the interests of the political outgroups in this conversation. Additionally, we also want to be able to say that these conceptions interact with one another, right? So you cannot look at the CPC's construction of a political Chinese identity without looking at how ethno-nationalism is co-opted by CPC state discourses, right? Where it talks about 5000年的文明, right? Stretching all the way back to 夏朝, 商朝, 周朝. Right? Alternatively, the selective appropriation and instrumentalization of rituals as a means of saying, look, 我们才是礼仪之邦，他们那些是蛮夷的, right? That kind of narrative construction is political, but it also weaves together values, ethnicity, culture, and civilization. So you can't separate these like a pick and choose menu in Ben and Jerry's, alternatively in a 7-Eleven with, this rice, right? So you can't do that. Okay. So what then can we do, and what is my view on what Chineseness is? And this is my final part of my presentation, 1 minute, very quickly. In my view, the best compromise is to adopt a dualist approach to Chineseness, to be a pluralist empirically, but to be normatively and aspirationally, culturalist. And that is to say, we can recognize as it stands, there are many different views and interpretations of Chineseness. And we can also acknowledge the role of the political elite in constructing and shaping the identity, as Yuri Pines writes about in their historical account of the past, but also acknowledge the bottom-up agency of people like you and I. We are, of course, not in a government, or at least 99% of us aren't in a government. We're not officials. We don't have political power, but we too can shape our understanding of Chineseness, right? Why can't Labubu be a part of Chineseness? Why can't, am I drinking 喜茶, alternatively 内学的茶, be a part of Chineseness? Why can't 小确幸, alternatively, even lying flat, which is very politically incorrect to say, but I'm saying it anyway. Why can't these attributes of Gen Z culture be imbued into Chineseness alongside all the impressive accomplishments that China has pulled off over the past many decades? So these are the questions I have. I don't think Chineseness is static. It evolves like a Pokemon, right? You start with a chameleon and it evolves into Charizard, right? So on and so forth. So if we can understand identity through more dynamic lenses, then perhaps we can liberate ourselves from, what the Chinese would term 本本主义, doctrinalism, so to speak. Second thought, and this is the final concluding thought, aspirationally, we should take a culturalist approach to Chineseness. So yes, I think, Daniel, you are Chinese because your culturally, your values, your rituals, and your knowledge of Chinese culture and philosophy, frankly, I don't think anyone here knows more about, these intricacies of Xunzi versus Mengzi as you do, right? Or maybe Han Feizi as well, just throw them in for the sake of throwing them in, So the gist here is if we take a more culturally oriented approach to identity definition, then perhaps that then allows us to liberate ourselves from the shackles of ethnic tensions, of sectarianism, and also unduly and overtly narrow bigotry that is now plaguing many forms of nationalisms we see in the West, including white nationalism, including nationalism that glorifies, supposedly, we were here before you were, even though, of course, as we all know, the Americas were invaded and then colonized by settlers from the old world. And I think this is a statement that shouldn't be controversial, but is controversial now to say that when we think of who belongs to a place, who owns a land, who constructed the value, who added value to land, these are all political questions. The way we narrate our histories is innately political, but what we can at the very least do is to make a conscious political choice to ensure that our future identities and our developments of identities can be decoupled from the most narrow and damning parts of our past, the rather unillustrious and also perhaps darkest episodes of human history and civilizational trajectory. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so very helpful. Before I open it up, maybe I will ask the panelists if they have questions for each other. Maybe I'll quickly begin with Professor Wang with Brian. So you had an article in the South China Morning Post where you drew on your own personal experience of when you discovered you were Chinese. Why don't you say a bit about that?
Wow, thank you. I didn't expect that. Well, long story short, I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I'm a honky. I'm proud of that fact. Come on, so I was always raised kind of blind and oblivious to my Chineseness, right? Because hang out with friends, we wouldn't say, oh, I'm Chinese, you're Pakistani, because we'd all be Hong Kongers, right? And at the same time, whenever I traveled to the mainland, I would say I'm from Hong Kong, and then my friends would say, 我是上海的上海人, or 我是北京人的. Okay, so long story short, they would identify themselves with the place names, not I'm Chinese. So this notion of my being Chinese was quite alien and foreign to me, all the way up until I went to, this really wonderfully cold, wonderfully tasteless and bland place in the UK called Oxford. Yes, the food is very bad there, and the sun sets at 3, but it's lovable and it's beautiful. So long story short, that was where I realized actually what it means to be Chinese. When I was told on the streets, when I was campaigning for Britain to remain in the EU, I was told by a Brexiteer to expletive F back to Hong Kong, F back to China. And then they said, you Chinese have nothing to do with us here, go back to where you're from. And that was when I realized, actually, when you're in a minority in a place, and when folks remind you of your being a minority, that's when you get to understand, A, that you really are in a minority, and B, maybe all this sort of romanticization that we see folks often assigning to Britain, saying, Britain's a land of the free and civilized. I mean, the elements of that for sure, but we also have to be cognizant of the darker sides and the shades of gray undergirding the story, so to speak. And so my realization of what Chineseness meant to me was really a reaction to the environments I was situated in. It feeds into, by the way, my account that identity is often socially constructed, and what we can at the very least do is to call ourselves out for our being captured by certain unduly, simplistic narratives, such as, Britain's more accommodating than Hong Kong, or we don't need to think about Chineseness. Chinese does not exist. We live in a post-race society, race-blind society. These narratives we hear a lot of. But are they true? Where are they true? For whom are they true? These are all political questions. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe a quick question for Albert, for Professor Chen. Just is it possible, I know not everybody supports this view and it's more of a abstract question, for me to be a Chinese citizen if I applied?
Yes, I know of a professor originally from US. I think you know him too. He is he has naturalized as Chinese citizen. He has been a professor at HKU for many years, but he was originally American. So he's ethnically not Chinese, but it is possible. Actually, this concept of naturalization as a national of a particular state is present in the nationality law of all states. So when the late Qing dynasty in 1909 enacted China's first nationality law, it already provided for not only the determination of who is a Chinese national or citizen, but also methods like the acquisition of Chinese nationality by naturalization, and also the loss or renunciation of Chinese nationality. So nationality is something which can be acquired by birth, but it can also be acquired by naturalization in the course of one's life. And then somebody who is the national of a particular state can also change his or her nationality, renounce it, or otherwise lose it. So the possibility of naturalization of a foreign citizen, a foreign national as a Chinese national exists under all three nationality laws of modern China: the late Qing nationality law, the ROC, Republic of China nationality law, which is in force in Taiwan today, and also the PRC nationality law. So there's a process of application. You need to satisfy certain conditions. But if your wife is Chinese, I think that is a very important factor which will be favorably be considered in leading to your application for naturalization being approved, or you have worked in China, you know Chinese language. All these factors can be taken into account. Not only now, but even under the older nationality laws of the late Qing or the Republican period. So, yeah, when Hong Kong was a colony, the many Hong Kong Chinese applied to be naturalized as British citizens. I'm sure people of my age or know about friends and relatives who have naturalized to become British, but they were not originally British because they were not born in Hong Kong. So in order to become a British national, they have to, or even BNO, they have to be naturalized.
Okay, very helpful. Okay, of course, the one practical consideration is those who have PRC passports applying for visas can be very problematic, right? But one question then for Professor Wong, because you should just say a little bit about why blindly obeying your parents is a kind of misinterpretation of Xia. I mean, yeah.
Well, that's a very long argument, but I'll give a relatively short version of it. Thinking about the archetypal figure of filial piety, that's Emperor Shun. Yeah, Shun's father tried to kill him at least 3 times, and he was still very filial to his father. Till at that time he was over 50 years old, and it's recorded in Mencius, in Mengzi, that he said, "I saw young people love beautiful girls or love like treasures, money, but only Shun, when he is still was 50 years old, he was still so filial, like craving for his parents' love." And there's a saying that 大孝终身慕父母, as long as you just the greatest filial piety means that you're still eager, longing for your parents' love at a very old age. So what did Shun do? If Shun was blindly obedient to his father, then he will let his father kill him. And there was a very famous example in Mencius as well, that one of his students, nowadays we call them 杠精, I just wanted to challenge Monsius that I don't think Shun was very filial because he got married without telling his parents. And Shun said, okay, another standard of filial piety is that you really need to get married and have heir, like a son. That's another thing we need to criticize probably next time. But this time, what I wanted to mention is that Mencius mentioned that Shun didn't obey to his father's will so that he can fulfill a better form of filial piety. So there is, you can see the filial piety is very subtle. It's not one thing that, oh, listen to your parent. No, it's very subtle. According to Xunzi and also Xiaojing, if you wanted to debate with your parents, remember to cite this paragraph without mention where did you learn from. Don't say that I mentioned that today. Xiaojing said the lowest form of filial piety is to listen to your parents. Okay, serve your parents according to the ritual. And the second, the better filial piety is that to serve your ruler, to be a public official in the government, okay? And the best, the greatest filial piety, what that is to 从道不从君. You follow the Tao and rightness, the Yi, and you do remonstrance to your ruler. So that would be the greatest filial piety. So filial piety is entails so many different levels, and sometimes when we argue with our parents, grandparents, we argue at the lowest part. So that's a short answer to this question.
Okay, thank you very much. So any other questions among ourselves before we move on? Yes.
Just a quick question. What's the relationship, if any, between China and Chineseness? And I'm asking this not as a trivial claim of, are you a Chinese citizen, but it's more, can we have disparate conceptions of Chineseness versus, China that are not based on the same organizing principle? Maybe a political versus ethnic, political versus cultural.
Well, why don't you say what you think?
What do you think, Daniel? Okay.
Well, yeah, I know. So Du Weiming, Professor Du Weiming famously argued that to be Chinese is a purely cultural thing, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the political community. Yeah, but I don't know. My intuition, and I don't. It's not a developed intuition. Is that if if I'm from Montreal I've never been to China, and maybe even if I speak the language, but I have no attachment to the country, to the land, or to the people there, it seems a little bit odd to say that that I am kind of Chinese. I'm not sure why that is, but that's my off the top of my head intuition. But why don't you say what you think?
I think my intuitive thought is we can distinguish between politically Chinese, culturally Chinese, and also civilizationally Chinese. Culturally is you like the he cha, not he cafe. You enjoy, Wan Guandan. Maybe that's also a cultural Chinese. Okay, civilizational Chinese. You enjoy reading all the ancient creeds and learning from the great sages. But political Chinese is you identify yourself as a subject of the PRC or of the Chinese state. And that in turn is a different conception. But the three of them are interlinked. So that's my take. They're all interlinked.
To be like being a subject, it means identifying with the country and in some way or other, right?
Right.
Anyway, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. That's helpful. Any other? No. Okay, so let's open it up for discussion, and feel free to. These are obviously somewhat open-ended issues, so feel free to veer in different directions. Yes, and maybe introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much, and panelists, thank you so much for your amazing presentation. My name is Athawat. You look at my name. My name is Athawat, but I am from Thailand. I'm PhD candidate here, but I am ethnically Chinese Thai. I'm Huai Thai born, right? And then the question that I want to ask you is about the first phase of your title, being Chinese, and you say that the inspiration, the motivation of this book is when you was asked about being Chinese and becoming Chinese, My question is very simple, but it has very profound implication. When you got asked this question, were you asked in Chinese or in English? This question is very important because in Chinese, 华人 Chinese, 中国人 Chinese, or even in my great grandparents from Chaozhou, so they call it 唐人 or 等人, also Chinese. So the questions, the language that that inspire you to be the writer or the editor of this book is very important. So my question is quite short. When you got asked this question, were you asked in English or in Chinese? And also what inspired me to be in this panel is that my PhD dissertation here in HKU is exactly on this topic. And I am a political scientist by training. So it's not only about being Chinese or becoming Chinese, but I am ethnic Chinese Thai. And there are many ethnic Chinese in South Asia. The question that we ask is not only being Chinese or becoming Chinese, but about becoming more Chinese or becoming less Chinese, and also departing from Chinese and also becoming Chinese again. Yeah. So I think the concept of being Chinese and becoming Chinese, I think is really important, and I really like this book. And I did not have a chance to read it yet, but I will definitely read it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So just, in my case, of course, it's learning the language and speaking the language that, and this goes to the point that I think a minimum like standard of, being considered Chinese is speaking the language. I mean, if you don't speak the language at all, then it would seem odd. So in my case, it's when this issue comes up, it's not like people ask me. Usually it's little kids like 3 or 4 years old. It happened just on campus a few days ago. It was a little kid looked up to me and he said, "Oh, why grand?" And then I feel like, on the one hand, I look around and I say, "Tsainali, where's that foreign?" But then I feel like, telling that kid, "You're the guy who's the foreign here. I belong." Anyway, whatever. So it's being not confront, and also more positively as it's not just, by the way, when people say it's not 差不多中国人, 就是中国人嘛, they don't say 差不多. It's 差不多, it's like already subtracting all that. It's as a term of praise. What exactly does that mean? That's what motivated, at least in my case, the issue.
So Chineseness is something, is a word which has been used in some of the chapters. For example, Zhao Tingyang's chapter 1 begins with a discussion of Chineseness. But Chineseness is a term which is in English. I don't know how to express it in Chinese. Have anyone thought about? I mean,
What do we know how we're going to translate that term?
So it is not easy to translate into Chinese. Maybe people, maybe Chinese people don't think about Chineseness if there's no word for Chineseness in Chinese. So 中国人 is a word which has been used. I think Brian talked about 华人. So some people regard themselves as 中国人 or 华人. 华人 maybe for overseas Chinese, 华侨. And 中国人 maybe even some people who have a non-Chinese nationality or citizenship may still identify themselves as 中国人. So and I also give the example of the Qing nationality law of 1909 using exactly the words 中国人. So maybe it's a question of identity, whether you think of yourself as 中国人. That's why there are a lot of surveys asking Hong Kong people, are you 香港人 or 中国人? So I think the question of Chineseness may be a question of Chinese identity. How do you identify yourself? Do you identify yourself as a Chinese, as a member of the Chinese nation or Chinese community? And then question of legal identity is another thing. It's entirely defined by nationality law. So the case of Taiwan is interesting because many Taiwan people consider themselves Taiwanren and not 中国人. So I think maybe Chineseness is a question of identity. 身份认同. So that is a Chinese term.
Any other? Yes, again, please introduce us. Maybe it's not on the microphone.
My question is about a fundamental tension, I believe, between the Chineseness and modernity. Because as far as I'm concerned, Chinese ethics is based largely on ethics of responsibility and obligation. As Benjamin Schwartz, a very famous sinologist, has argued, the Chinese political order is largely universal kingship, which means the king or the emperor represent the Tiandao, the way of heaven, and who those obey the Tao. The legitimacy derives from the Tao. And however, the modernity is largely derived from private rights. It's largely an ethics of rights. So do you believe that tension is fundamental, or it can be reconciled between Chinese ethics of obligation and the modernity ethics of rights? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge and very important question. But I'm not sure I would draw such a sharp contrast between rights and obligations. I mean, respecting rights also involves obligations and duties. But to go to your first point, I think about whether monarchy, I guess that's what another point you were making, is central to the idea of Chinese political identity. It's true that historically that's been the case, but obviously the past 100 years or so or more, it has not been the case. So if we're talking about what it means to become Chinese, politically Chinese now, I guess the idea of monarchy wouldn't be invoked as a necessary condition. I mean, personally, I think that there are some more mainstream central values to the idea of Chinese political identity, like this idea that in Chinese would be 贤能政治, that there's always been this idea that China's a huge country and we're going to have a complex bureaucratic system. That's been the case for more than 2,000 years. And the question is, how do we select and promote public officials with spirit, ability, and virtue? That's been a central question throughout at least Chinese imperial history. And it's still a central question now. If you were to ask me what's really central about being politically Chinese, I would point to that value more than monarchy as central. But I don't know.
I think that traditional China, of course, had its own political system, the Tiansha system, universal kingship, and so on. But that traditional worldview and traditional political system have already disintegrated with modernization. So now the question is how to engage in the project of so-called creative transformation of Chinese tradition, 中国文化的创造性转化. I think the scholar originating from Taiwan, Lin Yushen, has many decades ago already proposed the creative transformation of the Chinese tradition, which means not completely abandoning it, like Confucius or Mencius or all these Chinese classics, Tang poetry, Song Ci, Tang Shi. All these are part of the Chinese tradition, and they can still be promoted and learned even today. But some aspects of the Chinese tradition need to be more modernized. For example, it is said that the traditional Chinese worldview did not have the concept of rights or individuals' rights. But now, at least from the legal point of view, most 99% of mainland Chinese scholars who know about law accept that there are rights protected by the Constitution and protected by the law of China. So the concept of rights is as important as the concept of obligations or duties as far as contemporary Chinese law is concerned. And I think this is quite influential because now Chinese government encourages citizens to learn the law, 依法治国, 建设社会主义法治国家,依法, and the law is is a law that recognizes individuals' rights. And yet we have laws like the 民法通则, sorry, not 民法典, the code of civil law, which tells you all about the civil rights of people in China.
Of course, law is central to Chinese political culture. I mean, there's two mainstream political traditions of one is Confucianism, but the other is legalism, Fajia. But Fajia doesn't have anything about individual rights. Well, this is a case where creative transformation would be necessary.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good question because like 20 years ago, there's a huge debate about, you probably heard of that 古今中西. So the difference between China and the West is the difference between pre-modernity and modernity, or just the East-West difference. And now I think everyone agrees that it's like we have to combine those both perspectives. And so there is a trend in Confucianism. We call it a progressive Confucianism. Means like we do not just abandon this tradition. Like during the Second World War, He Ling, a very famous professor, He Ling, he was the first one to translate Hegel into Chinese. He said that if we just want to steal modernities, to steal these things from the West, how can we absorb that? How can we just to say to have a real modernity? Don't be a steal. Don't be just a thief. So he said we need to transform to make our tradition adapt to modern values. So important modern values like, as you mentioned, personal right, human right, gender equality, of course, and like social justice. So but on the political part, there are some different opinions. One part of them think Chinese tradition, political tradition should be completely abandoned. And we endorse the 自由民主, liberal, like democracy 就可以了. That's all. That's one part. And another part is thinking that we should modernize the political meritocracy and combine some democratic practices for China. So there's different scholars argue on this point. So if you have interest, you can contribute to this issue in the future. Yeah.
Right, so Brian, there's quite a few, but so go ahead, Brian, and then.
Take the questions, I can respond later. So good.
Okay, why don't we, yes. Yeah, but keep your questions brief because we're running out of time.
I have a question for Professor Daniel. There's quite a difference between Western values and ideologies, between Western values and ideologies and Chinese value and ideologies. So may I ask, how did you change yourself from the Canadian way to the Chinese way?
So, yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of this before, but you know, the Canadians often distinguish themselves from Americans because they say we're less concerned with blind pursuit of individual autonomy. We're more concerned with harmonious society, with social relations. So maybe there seems to be it resonates more with the kind of the Chinese way, so to speak. So maybe it's an easier transition from Canada to China than from the US to China. But I'll just leave that as an open issue. Let's have other, yeah, yes.
Well, thank you, professors, for your wonderful presentation. Well, I try to make my question short, but basically what Professor Wang just talked about his experience being a Hong Kongese, growing up in Hong Kong, and later on protesting in the UK, but then being called Chinese. Obviously, I was born and raised in mainland China, but I did my secondary education in Hong Kong. And back then, I had like basically, I feel like I have always had a different idea of the role of law in my heart as a mainland Chinese. But then coming here to study as a secondary education student, learning from my Hong Kong peers about, what law is, the role of law in society, I feel like there is like a subtle difference or, differences between what mainland Chinese think of law and what Hong Kong people think of law. So currently I am applying for a JD degree and potentially a PhD in the future. And I was just wondering if I were to do a research that it's related to the perception of the role of law for both mainland Chinese and for Hong Kong people, if there is any advice as to how to conduct such research and what is the role of law like in the history of Chinese political thought specifically. So that's my question. Thank you.
Professor Chen is the expert.
I think the question you raised involve at least two kinds of research. One is research into traditional Chinese legal theory and practice, legal philosophy and legal practice in traditional China. So that kind of research is basically library, online research. You just research the various, books and articles written by leading scholars in the field. And then the second kind of research is empirical research. So you may need to learn some social science research methodology, sociological research methodology, so as to do this kind of empirical research by interviewing people, doing surveys. There's a lot of today there's a lot of socio-legal research which are not necessarily done by law scholars, but are done by legal sociologists. So those law scholars who want to do the empirical research will have to learn the sociological method. I think, Brian, you are from the Faculty of Arts, but can you also give some advice on sociological research, empirical research?
Sure. I was just going to answer your question very quickly, and then I'll offer my 2 cents. I actually think that this is not a judgment of good or bad, merits or demerits, but the law in the mainland is a tool of governance, and the law in Hong Kong and in many other common law jurisdictions is an insurance against the government and others in society. 法律作为一个治理工具 versus 法律作为一个社会保险. That's the way I see it. And I've actually been asked exactly that question in the past. And there's nothing wrong with 治理工具, by the way. I'm not saying this, as if it's a negative thing, but that's just how it's seen. In terms of sociology, bottom-up experiences, anthropological approaches, talking to people. One of my favorite scholars in social sciences and humanities is Xiang Biao. And Xiang Biao, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his works, but Xuanfo, 那个浙江村, he works a lot on lived experiences of individuals who are in the underbellies of societies in the mainland. And he basically says, if you want to understand good theory, you've got to reach out to your 附近, the nearby around you, and absorb them and take them in, and explore as many 附近 as possible, right? Because if you don't look into 微观, 就是 observe closely, right, granularly, the 附近, then you would never see past the surface. I think Xiang Biao's writings are worth checking out. He's now at the Max Planck, but he was previously a professor of anthropology in Oxford.
Thank you. Albert, do you agree with this sharp distinction between law in mainland and law in Hong Kong?
That is one way of looking at it, but even I think in every legal system, the law also performs some function of 治理工具 as a tool for governance. even in the US, there have been a kind of, there are different schools of thought, but one school of thought is that of legal sociology, using the law as an instrument to bring about progress and reform. So the traditional Chinese view, which is 法家, did emphasize law as an instrument for the ruler to govern effectively. And that has to be modified because, I mean, in modern times, that traditional view has to be modified. So to add into the perspective that the law should also protect people's rights and does not just give powers to the government. So this rights, so the modern idea is that you have power on one hand and rights on the other hand. So the power of so the law facilitates the exercise of power by the government, but at the same time, the law should protect the rights of citizens and other people. I think you talk about 社会保险, is that right? 社会保险 is about protecting the rights of people in society. Is that what you mean? Yes.
Okay, yes. Again, keep your questions short, please. Why don't we take, we'll take 3 questions. Yeah.
So thank you, professors. So backstory is this summer I interned in Alpha Education, which is a Toronto-based charitable organization that conducts research on World War II in Asia. And from that experience, I learned that actually this is essential to Chinese identity because World War II in Asia is the most substantial tragedy that's shared by a collective victimhood among Chinese people. And so the story is before last year, there's a Taiwan intern that in her first week into this internship, she has an identity crisis because back in Taiwan, the ruling party has diminished a lot of history in the curriculum, and they refuse to teach this specific part of history because they think this is used by the CPC to enforce this sort of Chinese identity, and they wish to distinguish between the Taiwanese citizens and the mainland Chinese citizens. So in this scenario, how would you professors address this kind of identity crisis, given the people in Taiwan, as Professor Chen has just mentioned, they adopt the nationality law of ROC, so technically that's still China. So under like one China policy, like no matter ROC or PRC, like they are both China. So everyone in those 2 places, all citizens, they are Chinese citizens. But because of this narrative of the ruling party now, the people in Taiwan, they think they are politically not Chinese, but culturally they are Chinese. And I think this is a contradiction that is quite interesting to me. And this question also applies to, let's say, Hong Kong as a post-colonial place that back in, let's say, the British rule, they tried to diminish this Chinese identity. So after Hong Kong is being handed over to China, how do we reconstruct the Chinese identity, and how do professors you see how can we address this kind of identity dilemma when there's a conflicting identity among the same person? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of what you said. Before you talk about Taiwan, you talk about some problem in China.
So
What problem do you talk about? Before you talk about Taiwan, you talk about something which I didn't hear.
this is the ruling party in Taiwan.
Before you talk
Identity dilemma. Identity dilemma. World War II in Asia. World War II in Asia. The second Japanese Silent Japanese War.
Yeah. But anyway,
I missed the first part. Maybe you can talk about it in Chinese. What is the first part of what you said?
抗日战争.
Oh, 抗日战争.
Yeah.
So what is the relevance of 抗日战争?
Also, because this is one of the central parts of the enforcement of Chinese identity in the current CPC agenda.
Oh.
Yeah.
okay. So anyway, it is a very practical issue. It's not just theory, right? What do we teach in schools about Chinese identity and how to promote Chinese identity in Hong Kong? It's a very live issue. So these are very interesting questions. I think let's yes.
I think understanding of Chinese would be fundamentally different from the logic of immigrant country like America and Canada and Australia. So there's an interesting thing. So 2 years before Japan, Miss Japan actually elected a Ukrainian as the Miss Japan winner of Miss Japan, but she was actually born and raised in Japan. And I asked a Japanese friend about that. He said that Miss Japan should be won by a Yamato people. And by Yamato people, it's like separate and distinctive concept from being having been Japanese on paper and on passport. So in the same gist, I think in all the East Asian civilization, being Chinese, being 中国人 is different from being part of the 中华民族. You can be part of 中华民族 without being 中国人, and the same way counterwise. So that's probably a bad news for Daniel in terms of the being part of becoming Chinese. So I think maybe a bit more of comparative analysis on countries of similar situation as the distinction between being a national of a country versus being culturally attached to this meta identity that does not only, it includes ethnicity, cultural, history, and all that sort that blinds into this mega concept.
Sure, but I think it's important as you say the comparative analysis, but what I heard is that in Japan and Korea, it's much harder for people who are not from those countries to be really integrated and to be treated as a kind of one of us compared to mainland China. Anyway, I'll just throw that up. And yes.
Hello, my name is Alex. I'm a law undergraduate student here at HKU. So I'm really into nationalism recently. And when I'm researching on Chinese nationalism, I realized a very a continuum theme of ostracization, perhaps mentioned by Professor Wong before. So there is a very adversarial conception back from the germination of Chinese identity, arguably Boxer Rebellion. Then came the way to 1911 revolution, then the anti-Japanese resistance, coming to the way to that time it's about defending territorial integrity. Now it's about encroaching upon Chinese developmental progress. So regarding the state's narrative, now we've seen that this kind of narration is continuously being capitalized on. For example, in recent Chinese Communist Party's 100th anniversary, she vowed to let the enemies of China to break their heads.
Okay, what's your question, please? Keep it
Yes,
short.
sorry. My question is that why is that kind of adversity so continuous in Chinese perception of national identity? And is Chinese national identity drifting towards this kind of monolithic conception?
Okay, I think these are all great questions, but due to limited time, here's what I suggest. I want each of the panelists to think about what should be taught in Hong Kong schools about Chinese identity. Just say one thing and how it should be taught. And Brian, why don't you start? And keep it short, please.
那白川有容乃大. I don't think nationalism, well, firstly, I'm a skeptic of nationalism in general, but secondly, if we are building a national identity, it should be inclusive as opposed to exclusionary. It should be culturalist as opposed to ethnocentric. And above all, I don't see why we can't have one country, two systems centered and themed attempts to construct nationhood applied to both Hong Kong and Taiwan. But the key prerequisite is you need to reconcile as opposed to creating this false dichotomy between Chineseness and Hong Kongness. We can be a Hong Kong Chinese and a Chinese in Hong Kong. Why not?
Okay, good, thank you.
Many questions have been raised, but Daniel, you have asked a question of teaching in school. So I suppose Hong Kong people, most of them are Chinese. They are actually Chinese nationals according to the Chinese nationality law. Even though some of them have BNO passports, but they are regarded under Hong Kong and Chinese law as travel documents only. So they are still, according to Chinese law and Hong Kong law, Chinese national. So most people in Hong Kong, most children who are going to schools are actually Chinese national. So first they should be taught the concept of nationality or citizenship. 中国国民, 中国公民,中国国民, what is it? Because many people don't have any idea of Chinese nationality. They only have the idea that we are 香港居民, 香港永久性居民. But 香港永久性居民 include Chinese nationals and non-Chinese nationals. So probably if I don't know if you are not a Chinese national, you are 香港永久性居民. If you have resided in Hong Kong for 7 years and you want to take Hong Kong as a permanent home. Okay, so the concept of Chinese nationality, and of course the concept of China, including Chinese history, Chinese language, Chinese culture. So learning Chinese language, I agree with Daniel that it is best to learn Chinese language if one want to be a Chinese or have Chinese identity or know about China. Although I recognize that there are some patriotic people who don't know much Chinese, but they also identify themselves as Chinese and identify themselves with the People's Republic of China. So knowing the Chinese language and mastering it is not a prerequisite, I think, of being a Chinese.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thinking about teaching in Hong Kong, because I'm from School of Chinese, so most of my students would go to the primary and secondary school in Hong Kong teaching Chinese literature and Chinese history. But other than that, something I would like to propose that probably our students can learn how to do calligraphy in school. Thinking about that, we're using characters and traditional Chinese, and it would be nice if students know how to appreciate the characters rather than I just type using computer, just do typing. No, feel it, feel the structure of it, feel the feeling that's the brush. How does it move on different kind of paper? So I was thinking that would be a great experience for every student to have in school. Yeah.
Now you can even 写毛笔字 on the screen. I think you can using electronic pen. You can probably
Yeah, we lose lots of things because using brush on the special paper, that would be very different.
So thank you. My own view very quickly is what is China's greatest contribution to human civilization? The most influential thing that has affected almost everywhere? The examination system. Once people are aware of exams, they might fear them less. They said, we invented this. So there might be less fear of exams. That's my humble suggestion. So thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.